Hello and welcome to all of you who are joining me from the St Andrews Society of New York. I'm Andrew Baxter. I'm a professional tourist guide based here in the beautiful Scottish Highlands. And over the last year, I've been writing and hosting a whole series of virtual tours taking people from around the world to discover and explore some of the places in my homeland of Scotland. It's allowed us to indulge in a little bit of wanderlust whilst we're unable to travel. So I'm delighted that you've been able to travel, at least virtually, across the Atlantic to join me as part of your Tartan Day celebrations this year. And I've put together a mini tour investigating and exploring some of the places associated with that ultimate warrior and Scottish hero, William Wallace. So let's head out on our mini virtual tour right this second. So who was William Wallace? Well, much of the modern day myth of Wallace comes from Hollywood and a tanned Australian actor, Mel Gibson, and that film from 1995 called Braveheart. Because part of the problem that we have is many of the written records for the historical period don't actually mention William Wallace at all. And we have to rely on those written shortly after his death. Take, for example, the epic poem called The Wallace, written by the minstrel Blind Harry. It's a mixture of truth and fantasy, of facts and fiction. Or we have to rely on the romanticized version made up by the Victorians that resulted in that grand over-the-top memorial of the Wallace Monument sat upon Abbey Craig on the outskirts of the city of Stirling. And these versions of William Wallace lead to a commonly held view, even held today here in Scotland, that William Wallace was some sort of Scottish version of Robin Hood, a robbing from the rich to give to the poor, a man of the common people fighting against the noble aristocracy and privilege. And nothing could be further from the truth, because Wallace was a product of the noble classes. He was born either in a place called Aldersley in Renfrewshire or Ellerslie in Ayrshire. We're not entirely sure. We're not entirely sure of when he was born, but we know it is sometime in the 1270s, and that he was well educated. He had been sent away to be taught by an uncle who was a priest before finishing his education in Dundee. But thereafter, he somehow became an outlaw and wanted by the authorities. So if we look at all the representations around Scotland that we see of William Wallace today, the statues, the paintings, the books, the films and the documentaries, we can probably find 5 different versions of the life of William Wallace. We have the angry Wallace as depicted by a statue first erected in 1814 in the grounds of Dryburgh Abbey, down in the borderlands of Scotland, where we see a scowling Wallace looking out towards his English foes and the English King Edward I across the border from where he stands. Then we have the hunky Wallace, a version of our hero that we see on the Victorian Wallace Monument, erected in the mid-19th century, just a few miles from Stirling Bridge, possibly his greatest battle a victory. And then there's the hairy Wallace, a sort of great, a bushy giant of a man that we see in portraits and in statues at Paisley Abbey. And then there's the tanned superhero Wallace, as depicted in the 1995 blockbuster film. Even now we see a statue based on the actor Mel Gibson as William Wallace, erected in the car park, which seems quite an appropriate place for it, at the bottom of the Wallace Monument in Stirling. And then we have the fancy dress version of Wallace, which we see as over enthusiastic Scots get dressed up as their national hero, particularly at sporting events when we are on the field against English teams, or they get dressed up at weekends to reenact some of the battles from Scottish history, draped with plaid tartan and even painting their faces with the blue and white of the Scottish saltire. But let's leave the myths of Wallace behind and head to a real historical event, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, that took place on the 11th of September 1297. Our mini tour brings us first of all to the city of Stirling, with its medieval castle perched high above the rest of the city and the surrounding land, sat upon its volcanic plug. It's very different from the time when William Wallace was here. And at the beginning of our story, Edward the First has control over this important strategic point. There's an old Scottish saying, he who controls Stirling controls Scotland. And since 1296, the English king, Edward the First, has controlled both Stirling and the nation itself. But William Wallace and his loyal lieutenant Andrew de Murray have other ideas. They have captured the whole of Scotland north of the River Forth, and they now have their sights firmly set on taking Stirling, the castle itself, and the rest of their homeland. And with this news, the English King Edward I has sent his army, armed with 30,000 troops, northwards to take on William Wallace and Andrew de Murray. The real battle for Scotland is about to begin. Here, just a few miles northeast of the castle, the Scottish and English armies lined up either side of the River Forth. The English were led by the Earl of Surrey, who had marched up the southern banks of the River Forth, whilst Wallace and de Murray's men had positioned themselves high up on the heights of Abbey Craig on the opposite bank. Wallace and his men had arrived first, but they were enormously outnumbered by the English army, just 10,000 Scots compared to over 30,000 in the English ranks. But Wallace had positioned his men carefully and strategically to cut off a shallow ford across the river, which was an easier crossing below the rocky hill. The English had no choice but to find somewhere else to cross. The quickest alternative route was via a narrow wooden bridge, some 60 metres upstream from where the current Stirling Bridge, erected in the 1400s, stands today. The Earl of Surrey hesitated, though, before giving the order to cross. Wallace wisely waited until the first Englishman had crossed and landed on the opposite bank before springing his trap. He sent down his spearmen, who rushed down to attack, getting in behind the enemy lines to prevent retreat back across the bridge. And then his swordsmen swept head on into the advancing cavalry, bringing down both horses and slaughtering the fallen riders. Wallace and de Murray led from the front throughout, and soon panic-stricken English knights tried to escape by turning around and crashing into the English forces still streaming across the bridge. The bridge was so narrow it could only take two men side by side as they crossed, and soon, in no time at all, in the middle of this turmoil, it was jammed with men and horses. Some jumped from its parapet, others fell, many more were pushed off into the waters below. Watching this, the Earl of Surrey realised that the game was up and gave the command to retreat. The Battle of Stirling Bridge had been won. Soon Stirling Castle would fall to Wallace's troops, and the English were sent packing back to their own country. Wallace was now even more hated by the English King Edward I than before because he felt humiliated by this defeat. But he would not rest until he brought about Wallace's final downfall. So we head to the other side of Stirling now to find out more. We are stood on the banks of Lake Menteith, on the very southern boundary of the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park here in Scotland. Now we know that this lake was the home of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was smuggled here under the cloak of darkness as a 5-year-old queen to keep her out of the clutches of the marauding Henry VIII, the King of England, who was determined to marry her off to his oldest son. And she lived for several years on a small island within a priory along with her playmates. We're less sure whether William Wallace came this way, but we do know that this is the only lake in the whole of Scotland as a result of William Wallace. All the other bodies of water in Scotland are known as lochs. So this is a very, very lonely lake, but there being no others around. And the reason it is the only lake in Scotland, we are told, is because of the legend of William Wallace. We are stood in the very heart of Menteith country here, Clan Graham. The whole of this area would have been owned by the Earls of Menteith, and it was Sir John Menteith, the constable of Dumbarton Castle, who it is said betrayed William Wallace to the English king, the Hammer of the Scots, Edward I himself. And that treachery eventually led to William Wallace's arrest, his transportation to the Tower of London, his trial for high treason, and his eventual bloody and brutal execution. And as a result, the Scottish nobles back here in the Highlands decided that they would make an example of Menteith for years to come, that has come down the centuries, because they decided that this body of water was no longer worthy to be called a loch. It was no longer worthy to use the Scottish word, and so they renamed it the Lake of Menteith, and it's been known that ever since. No wonder it's a rather lonely lake with all the other Scottish lochs pointing at it and giving it the blame for the murderous execution of William Wallace. At least that's one story as to how the Lake of Menteith got its name. Another possible explanation dates back to the 17 and 1800s, when the British Army was surveying Scotland to make their maps of the countryside, and up until that point it had been known as the Loch of Menteith. Was it a poor British Army officer who had sat late at night looking at his notes by candlelight and accidentally transcribed the local name of Loch of Menteith to Lake of Menteith instead? Is that a possible reason as to why this is the only lake in the whole of Scotland? Or is it used to be known as the Lake of Menteith all along, but spelled L-A-I-C-H, which is the Scottish word for low? If you look out behind me there, it is quite a low place. Who knows? But I quite prefer the William Wallace story, other than our map-making error. That brings our mini tour following the footsteps of William Wallace to an end. I hope you've enjoyed it and been inspired to go and explore some more of the places associated with Wallace. Maybe you would like to join me this Saturday on the 10th of April for the full-length William Wallace tour, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. You can find all the details of that tour and many of the other ones that I am hosting throughout April and May on my website at www.glen2glen.com. I hope that you will be able to join me. But until then, haste ye back and goodbye from Scotland.